Hi everybody, my name's Liam. I'm a potter here in beautiful Denver, Colorado, and I want to talk about making plates today. Plates are a bit different than a lot of other pots. They require some special considerations to ensure the success of their making and firing without warpage and cracks. So join me on my plate making journey today, and I hope you enjoy. So I want to talk a little bit about plate making theory. And I know that sounds kind of funny, we're playing with mud, but it's really worth considering a couple things before you start. First of all, what are your plates going to be used for? I divide my plates into basically two categories. Flat and tall plates, or alternately, like a standard dinner plate or something that I would call a spaghetti plate, which has a slightly more bowl-shaped cross-section diameter. Diameter is kind of critical. I find that a good diameter for a dinner plate is about 11 inches. That's finished dimension is about right, so I throw them to 12. And they end up somewhere in the 10.5 to 11 inch range. Now if I'm throwing a set, I want to make sure that I get the dimensions right, and I want them to all be the same. My degree of tolerance with plates, if I'm making a set, is maximum deviance from size, probably a 1/4 inch. I really like to hit it within the 1/8 inch range. If something ends up being a 1/4 inch oversized or undersized, I usually throw it out and reclaim it before I fire. You really want them to look very similar when they're stacked, and you want them to also be the same height when they're in the stack. So you don't want some of them really close together and others far apart. You don't want one really deep and one really shallow. They should be consistent. So, let's talk about plates cracking. So cracking happens usually in the drying phase. It's not even really the firing where cracking happens, at least in my experience. It's usually during the drying phase. And that is because you have something that is basically disc-shaped. And I'll draw it from above. Here's your plate. What happens is the edges dry first. So this whole zone on your plates dries first. The rim that's up off the bat and is being dried from both sides, versus the bottom has the bat underneath it, so no air can get to it, and it dries last. And what happens is this area shrinks first. And so what can happen at this phase is you can get a crack because it's trying to shrink inwards and the clay in the center isn't moving. Sometimes you can get a compression crack here, but that's fairly rare. Usually what happens is that the lip of your plate, which might have looked in cross section like this before, will now increase in steepness. This is an exaggeration, of course, because it has gotten smaller in diameter, and so the rim will actually raise in relation to the bowl of the plate. You want to avoid this as much as you can. It's really good to dry plates evenly under plastic. And the reason you want to avoid this is because now you've got this high rim and it dries out to bone dry and it can no longer move. And then what happens is this portion from here to here, which is still wet, now wants to shrink inside the dried rim. And the dried rim is now solid. So you get something where you've got this frame around the outside and the center is trying to shrink inwards like this as it dries, and you will either get a circular crack around the rim of the plate here, or you'll either get an S crack right down the center because the clay is trying to shrink away from itself after the perimeter has already dried. So drying these evenly is really crucial. I wire my plates off the bat right after I throw them, and then I let them dry under plastic really slowly on the bat for some time, and then as soon as they're hard enough to handle without distorting them, I pop them off and flip them over and stack them rim to rim. Provided I don't have a decorative rim detail that would be damaged by that, I stack them rim to rim under plastic, and I move them often so that they get even exposure to drying. So I move the bottom ones to the top, every couple of days, and then I move them back again. I keep them tightly wrapped, and they probably stay that way for a solid 2 weeks. And I really have good luck drying them that way. It's a slow process, but they rarely crack. So that's kind of the plate theory. The other thing is to prevent warping during firing. So we'll talk about warping. There are several types of warping that are concerning in plates. I would say that with slab-built plates, warping is far more extreme than it is with thrown plates, but it still happens in both. I'm going to talk mostly about thrown plates because that's mostly what I make. So here's issue number one, bottoms slumping. So if you have a plate that has a very small rim and then a wide base like this, and let's say your foot ring that you've trimmed in your plate is underneath like this, you've got a very large distance between here and here, where the clay, when it becomes plastic during firing, wants to kind of slump. So you might end up with a bottom that sags all the way down to the kiln shelf. If you make a plate like this, especially if this is a platter, where like maybe this is 16 inches from foot ring to foot ring, you're going to have some issues if your clay is a properly formulated stoneware clay that becomes completely vitreous at temperature. It's plastic enough to sag. So you're going to want to trim an extra foot ring closer to the center of the plate to prevent that. Another issue that can happen is if you're making very wide rimmed plates with narrow feed. Let's say you've got a plate that's like this, something that's more of like a spaghetti plate kind of thing. I hope that everybody kind of knows what I mean when I say spaghetti plate. Like a plate bowl, or like an open soup bowl kind of thing, in cross section it looks kind of like this. They can be very pretty. But let's say your foot ring is here, like this. Having a little bit of difficulty drawing today. I'm not doing so well, but you get the idea. So if your foot ring is here, basically from the center of the plate to here, this forms a lever arm. And when this all becomes plastic, your pivot point is here, and this rim wants to slump down, and pivoting over this point, it's actually going to push the bottom of the plate up. So you're going to end, when your rim overhangs this far over the foot, you're actually going to end up with a little bit of a upward bow in your bottom. That might happen, that might not. But in order to compensate for that, you want to make sure that you don't have a flat bottom. You have a bottom that's a little bit bellied downwards, so that if anything, it's going to warp to flat and not overshoot and become a hump, because that makes the plate, I don't want to say basically unusable, but it's really aesthetically and functionally annoying to have a lump in the bottom of your plate. And this really only happens when you have a wide overhang here and a very a clay that has a high plasticity at temperature. If you're using a really refractory body, it's probably not going to move much. But if you're using something like porcelain or a really vitreous stoneware, this may happen. So those are some of the main considerations I wanted to talk about with regards to that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate throwing those two types of plates, and then we'll probably trim them next week. So welcome to my wheel, everybody. Let's make some plates. I'm going to just dampen dampen things down a little bit. So this is my bat pad I'm making right now, as I always do. If you're thinking about throwing plates not on a bat, you're dicing with danger, I would say. There are some people who are able to do it, but I just think it's so much easier to use a bat. Yeah, I hardly know any production potters that don't make plates on a bat. It's really worth doing this way, because they're so floppy. If you try to lift a plate off after you've freshly thrown it, it's a recipe for warpage and distortion, and it's a bummer. So yeah, this bat's a little warped. I'm not going to use that one. Again, you want flat plates. There we go. So we've got our bat attached. So, if you're thinking about what a good starting weight for a plate is, this is 4 pounds, and I find for a dinner plate that's about right. If you can, use fairly soft clay. It really decreases the amount of work and the amount of strain on your wrists while you're doing this, because you really have to move that clay a good distance. So use soft clay. Yeah, just center as normal. This is fresh reclaim. It hasn't really been souring for very long, so it's kind of not the best. But we'll see what we can make happen here. I oftentimes will wedge a little bit of fire clay into my reclaim. I find that it really just helps adjust the consistency, and a lot of my clays are very vitreous to begin with, and so adding a little fire clay kind of helps with the stability and doesn't in any way really negatively affect the clay body. It just makes it a little stiffer while it's being fired. Especially with this clay, which is a black clay, and it has a tendency to bloat because it's got so much iron in it. So, what I'm doing now is, after my last cone down, I'm now going to throw my beginning lump out to the diameter that I want the foot to be of my plate. You don't want to open as you would a bowl and then try to press the material down towards the bat, because things will get all out of whack. You want to spread out your centered lump to the diameter of your plate. So I think that's about good visually. Usually if I were throwing set, I'd have a caliper set to this distance. For reference, for the video, that's 8 inches. So, now I'm going to begin opening, and I want to give myself a nice thick bottom. You don't want to skimp on your bottoms on plates. If you find that your bottom is really thin, start over, use more clay. It's not worth, when you're wiring through your plate and you can see the wire, the bulge from the wire through your clay, yeah, you're too thin. So, that's actually pretty much good. That's a solid 1/2 inch. I'm actually going to even add just a little bit. We want a good 1/2 inch. Now, a lot of people do this different ways. Some people will use their thumbs. I try to use the most ergonomical way to do this possible, which I find is just to literally just take my fist and to drag out like that. Sorry, that was a little quick, but I just use my this portion of my fist here to push the clay out this way. So now I'm using these fingers and the edge of my thumb to kind of move that bottom outwards, and my thumb here and these fingers are sitting under this rim, so basically I'm beginning to grab this thickness of clay here without decreasing the diameter of the bottom. I'm not pushing under, I'm just stabilizing here and pushing this clay across the top and kind of up my hand. So this is the point where we're ready to start working on the rim, but before we do that, I'm going to compress this bottom. And yeah, if you think you're done compressing, compress a little more. That's one of the main factors that prevents... Oh man, there's a bit of a storm coming up outside. This is one of the main factors that prevents cracking and warping is compression. And sometimes I think it's good to even experiment a little bit, with that concept and say, I'm going to throw 3 plates compressed and 3 without, and with near a guarantee that those 3 plates that you didn't compress will probably crack at some point along the way if you just open, go, and begin throwing. Can't emphasize that enough. So I'm going to use my small rib here. I use almost always wooden ribs. For some reason I'm not a real fan of the silicone ribs, but that's total personal preference. Don't let me put you off of the silicone ones. They work just as well. Just for the sake of compression, I'm not necessarily going to leave this rib finish. I sometimes like to have a little swirl in the bottom of my plate. So yeah, I think that's probably good. So I'm just gonna come in there and add a little swirl. All right. So what I did there just now is I just kind of pushed up that rim that we formed earlier. By the way, if you haven't noticed yet, this is going to be the spaghetti plate kind of plate, not the flat plate. So I'm going to throw this wall completely vertically. I'm going to throw this wall pretty much completely vertically, and about that thick. Yeah, about that thick. Don't go too thin. It's not worth it. You're going to trim these anyway, and you really want to make sure that you have enough thickness here to withstand what you're about to do next. So before I lay down the rim, I'm leaving the rim thick because as it stretches out, it's going to thin. So I'm leaving it just a tad thicker than the wall thickness. And I'm going to clean that clay up around the base first. So now, I like to keep my hands clean while I'm throwing plates. I just find it keeps the little bits of slip and little chunks and stuff off of the plates. With pots, I don't really bother too much with that, but with plates, I find it useful. So now, we're basically going to lay this rim down with a rib. I'm going to go to 12 o'clock right above where I'm sitting, and I'm just going to start to push that rim over with the rib. Like that. You can kind of adjust that shape a little bit. Sometimes I come in here with the base of the rib and kind of clean up that transition a little bit. Make that corner really nice looking. Because that's a place where your eye is going to gravitate towards in the finished plate. You kind of want that transition nice. I'm going to lay it over just a smidge more because I know it's going to come up a little bit during drying. I'm going to give the inside here one last working over. And I'm going to very, very, very lightly sponge the whole thing. I'm going to clean up that rim, and then I'm going to clean up the inside here. Not so much that I'm wiping away all of the fine material in the clay and exposing the grog, but just enough to kind of clean up the little slip loogies that are formed on the surface. So, I'm going to wire this off right away. Like so. And that's that plate. So, detach that from my bat pad, and I'm going to make type number 2 now. Okay, now this rib has already been used for this a bunch of times, but I usually don't use my rib as a scraping implement. I usually use my wooden knife because they get worn down really easily. I can always sharpen a new end on this, but once the rib is half gone, well, you're without a rib. You need a new rib. So, here's another 4-pound lump. We're going to center. Cone up and down 2 more times than you normally would, I would say. That allows you to align those clay particles better, have them shingle over each other more, and basically that's just another form of compression. Especially if you're using fresh clay that hasn't been sitting for some time to sour, like I am. This was reclaimed 2 days ago, and I just dried it out and wedged it. So now we're making the wide plate. Same process as before. So what I'm doing here is I'm pressing down with the bottom of my fist, and my hand here, which is braced into my hip bone, or into my pelvis, I guess, is keeping this from expanding too quickly, and it's keeping it sealed down to the wheel head. Or down to the bat, rather. So, for this, I'm going to go out further before I form the rim. I'd say, maybe just a smidge more. Like that. So, we're going to test our thickness. Once you're halfway through a batch of 25, you'll start to know what that thickness is by eye and not have to check every plate. But especially if you haven't done it for a while, it doesn't hurt to check. So I'm using a little bit of a different technique here because there's less clay to move because it's already flatter, and I'm using my 2 thumbs together to kind of push outwards. Just make sure that you don't dig in too far, otherwise you'll jab your thumb into the clay and you'll peel off a whole chunk. So I'm going to approach this rim here just kind of like we did before. The process is almost exactly the same, just with different dimensions. I'm going to come over here and start to pull up this wall. Now you'll notice I made a little bit of an error there. There was a little bit of a concavity in the top of that rim, and I pushed those pieces of clay together, and there may have been some slip between there. Try to avoid that if you can. I'm just going to spend a second and kind of make sure that those two layers are kind of well stuck together. Just going to go over those a couple times so that I know that there isn't anything trapped in there that's going to split when it fires or, you know, crack when it dries. This has a little bit of a flatter bottom, I would say. Get our compression in. Alright, so there's that. Leave that little spiral in the middle. So I'm going to compress that rim between my fingers. That's a move I usually like to do. And I'm just going to lay the rim of the plate over like so. There, and there's a different kind of dinner plate. Now, same process basically as the other one, but very different looking result, I would say. Now, the thing I forgot to do is to get rid of that bit of clay before I laid the rim down. So I'm just going to cut a little undercut in underneath there for the wire. And that little bit of extra clay is just a little extra we'll have to trim off later. So if you remember, good idea to do that. Not the end of the world if you don't. I like to wire my plates off. Oops. I like to wire my plates off while they're spinning. I find that that keeps the wire down closer to the wheel. Because if I were to take this off, you know, you can wire it right after you stop the wheel straight. That's fine as well. But if you let these sit for any amount of time, the bat absorbs water out of the clay and forms kind of a hard layer. And then when you go to wire through, it forces the wire further up into the clay. And you lose some of your bottom on the bat. So it's really good to do it right away. So we'll trim these next week, and I'll go through that process. And thanks for watching. Have a good one.